but he seemed to have totally vanished. Level as appeared the northward prairie from the commanding height on which stood the throng of eager watchers, it was in reality a low rolling surface, like some lazily heaving sea that had become suddenly solidified. Long, broad, shallow dips or basins lay between broad, wide, far-extending, yet slight upheavals. Through the shallows turned and twisted dozens of dry arroyos, all gradually trending toward the Platte, the drainage system of the frontier. 5 miles out began the ascent to the taller divides, and ridges that gradually, and with many an intervening dip, rose to the watershed between the Platte and the score of tiny tributaries that united to form the South Cheyenne. It was over Moccasin, or 10-Mile Ridge, as it was often called, and close to the now abandoned stage road, Ray's daring little command had disappeared from view towards 8 o'clock. It was at least 2, possibly 3 miles east of the stage road that the solitary courier had first been sighted, and when later seen by the major and certain others of the swift-gathering spectators, he was heading for Frayne, though still far east of the high road. And now Mrs. Ray on the north piazza, with Webb by her side, and Nanny Blake, Mrs. Dade, and Esther in close attendance, was briefly telling the major what she had seen upstream. One glance through Sandy's glass had told her the little fellow had not watched in vain. Then, with a ready binocular, she had turned to the Indian encampment up the Platte, and almost instantly saw signs of commotion. Squaws and children running about, ponies running away, and Indian boys pursuing. Then, one after another, 3 Indians, warriors presumably, had lashed away northward, and she had sent Sandy on the run to tell the major, even while keeping watch on the threatening 3 until they shot behind a long, low ridge that stretched southward from the foothills. Beyond doubt, they were off in the hopes of bagging the solitary horseman, speeding with a warning of some kind for the shelter of Fort Frayne. By this time there must have been nearly 200 men, women, and children lining the crest of the bluff, and speaking in low, tense voices when they spoke at all, and straining their eyes for the next sight of the coming courier or the swift dash of the intercepting Sioux. Well out now and riding at a gallop, Blake and his half-dozen, wildly separating so as to cover much of the ground, were still in view, and Dade and his officers breathed more freely. "See what a distance those beggars of Strabers will have to ride," said the veteran captain to the little group about him. "They dare not cross that ridge short of 3 miles out. It's my belief they'll see Blake and never cross at all." Then uprose a sudden shout. "There he is! There he comes! See! See!" And 50 hands pointed eagerly northward, where a little black dot had suddenly popped into view out of some friendly winding watercourse 4 miles still away, at least count, and far to the right and front of Blake's easternmost trooper. Every glass was instantly brought to bear upon the swiftly coming rider, Sandy's shrill young voice ringing out from the upper window. "It isn't one of Papa's men. His horse is gray." Who then could it be? And what could it mean, this coming of a strange courier from a direction so far to the east of the traveled road? Another moment, and up rose another shout. "Look, there they are! Sioux for certain!" And from behind the little knob or knoll of the Meridian Ridge, 3 other black dots had swept into view, and were shooting eastward down the gradual slope. Another moment, and they were swallowed up behind still another low divide. But in that moment they had seen and been seen by the westernmost of Blake's men, and now, one after another, as the signal swept from the left, the 7 swerved. Their line of direction had been west of north. Now, riding like mad, they veered to the northeast, and a grand race was on between the hidden 3 and the would-be rescuers, all headed for that part of the low-rolling prairie where the lone courier might next be expected to come into view. Friends and foes alike, unconscious of the fact that, following one of those crooked arroyos with its stiff and precipitous banks, he had been turned from his true course full 3/4 of a mile, and now, with a longer run but a clear field ahead, was steering straight for Frayne. Thus the interests of the onlookers at the bluff became divided. Women with straining eyes gazed at the lonely courier, and then fearfully scanned the ridge line between him and the northward sky. praying with white lips for his safety, dreading with sinking hearts that at any moment those savage riders should come darting over the divide and swooping down upon their helpless prey. Men with eyes that snapped and fists that clenched, or fingers that seemed twitching with mad desire to clasp pistol butt or saber hilt, or loud barking carbine, ran in sheer nervous frenzy up and down the bluffs, staring only at Blake's far-distant riders, swinging their hats and waving them on, praying only for another sight of the Sioux in front of the envied seven, and craving with all their soldier hearts to share in the fight almost sure to follow. On Ray's piazza, with pallid face and quivering lips, Esther Dade clung to her mother's side. Mrs. Ray had encircled with her arm the slender waist of Nanny Blake, whose eyes never for an instant quit their gaze after the swift speeding dots across the distant prairie. All her world was there in one tall, vehement horseman. Other troopers mounting at the stables had spurred away under Captain Gregg and were splashing through the ford. Other denizens of Fort Frayne, hearing of the excitement, came hurrying to the bluff. Hangers-on from the trader's store and corral, the shopman himself, even the barkeeper in his white jacket and apron, 2 or 3 panting, low-muttering half-breeds, their eyes aflame, their teeth gleaming in their excitement. Then Hay himself, and with him, her dark-faced, almost livid, her hair discolored and lips rigid and almost purple, with deep lines at the corners of her mouth, Nanette Flower. Who that saw could ever forget her as she forced her way through the crowd and stood at the very brink, saying never a word, but swiftly focusing her ready glasses. Hardly had she reached the spot when wild, sudden, exultant, a cheer burst fiercely from the lips of the throng. "Look, look! By God, they got him!" yelled man after man in mad excitement. 3 black dots had suddenly swept into view, well to the right of Blake's men, and came whirling down grade straight for the lone courier on the gray. Theirs had been the short side, ours the long diagonal of the race. Theirs was the race, perhaps, but not the prize, for he had turned up far from the expected point. Still they had him, if only those infernal troopers failed to see them. There was their hope, plainly in view of the high bluff at the fort. They were yet hidden by a wave of prairie from sight of the interceptors, still heading for the ridge the warriors had just left behind. Only for a second or two, however, a yell of fierce rejoicing went up from the crowd on the bluff as the easternmost of Blake's black specks was seen suddenly to check, then to launch out again, no longer to the north but straight to his right, followed almost immediately by every one of the 7. Then, too, swerved the would-be slayers, in long, graceful circles, away from the wrath to come. And while the unconscious courier still rode, steadily loping toward the desired refuge, away from the breaks and ravines of the Sleeping Bear lashed the thwarted Sioux, away in hopeless stern chase spurred the pursuers, and while women sobbed and laughed and screamed, and men danced and shouted and swore with delight, one dark-faced, livid, fearsome, turned back from the bluff, and Dr. Tracy hastened to the side of his enchantress, caught in a maze. These words almost hissed between the set of grinding teeth. 7-3. Shame. End of chapter 7.